The moment my daughter-in-law leaned across my own kitchen table and said those words, I felt something shift in my chest. Not heartbreak, not anger. Something quieter than that. Something that had been building for almost 3 years. "You must be so embarrassed," she said, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. 63 years old, and you can't even hold down a part-time position at the library. What does that feel like, honestly? I set down my fork. I looked at her, and I smiled. She didn't know what that smile meant. She thought it meant I had nothing left to say. She was wrong. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 31 years as a senior auditor with the Canada Revenue Agency. I reviewed corporate tax filings, investigated financial fraud, testified in federal court on 3 separate occasions. I retired at 58 with a full pension and a letter of commendation from my regional director. I was not embarrassed about leaving my volunteer position at the Oakville Public Library. I had left it because my carpal tunnel had flared up badly that winter, and 2 evenings a week shelving books had become genuinely painful. But my daughter-in-law, my son Owen's wife Diane, had decided months earlier that I was declining, that I was becoming a burden, that my son deserved better than a mother who was, in her words, always around. I should start at the beginning, or at least closer to it. Owen was 34 when he met Diane. He'd been on his own for nearly a decade, living in a decent 2-bedroom apartment in Burlington, working as a mechanical engineer at a firm in Mississauga. He was careful with money the way I'd raised him to be. He had his RRSP, his TFSA, a modest emergency fund. He called me every Sunday. He was, genuinely, a good son. Diane was 31. She was pretty in that very deliberate way. The kind of pretty that takes considerable effort and is meant to be noticed. She had been married once before, briefly, and that marriage had ended under circumstances she described as too painful to discuss, which I respected at first. She worked in sales for a property management company in Etobicoke. She drove a leased BMW she mentioned often. They dated for 14 months before Owen proposed. I met her perhaps 6 times during that period. She was charming at dinners, thoughtful about asking questions, and she laughed at Owen's jokes in a way that made him stand taller. I was glad for him. I kept my reservations, small things, instincts more than evidence, entirely to myself. They married in September, small ceremony which was fine. Owen sold his apartment, and they moved into a semi-detached in Hamilton that Diane had found. She had insisted on Hamilton, she said, because Burlington was too expensive now, and Hamilton had so much character. The house was listed at $689,000. They put down $137,000, Owen's savings entirely, which he told me about with a kind of breathless pride that made something small twist inside me. I did not say anything. I drove down to see the house 3 weeks after they moved in. Diane showed me around with the energy of someone on a sales call. New backsplash in the kitchen, original trim in the dining room, so much potential in the basement. She used the phrase "our investment" 4 times in 20 minutes. What she did not mention, and what I noticed, was that the mortgage statement on the kitchen counter listed only Owen's name. I filed that away. Old habit. The first year was mostly fine. Owen seemed happy. I saw them at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at a birthday dinner for Owen in March. Diane was always there, always present, always just slightly at the center of every conversation. She had opinions about everything. About my house in Oakville, which she called a lot of space for one person. About my diet. About the fact that I still drove my 2019 Civic when I could, she said, easily afford something nicer. She started calling me by a nickname I hadn't asked for. Mo, instead of my actual name. I corrected her twice. After that, I stopped, because Owen looked uncomfortable when I did. And I didn't want him uncomfortable. The small things accumulated the way small things do, quietly, below the threshold of what you can reasonably object to, until one day you look back and realize you're standing in a very different place than where you started. In the second year, Diane began suggesting I was lonely. "Owen worries about you being alone up there," she would say, as though Oakville was somewhere remote rather than 40 minutes down the QEW. She suggested twice that I consider selling and moving into something smaller. A condo, maybe. You'd have people around, community, you wouldn't have to worry about the upkeep. I thanked her and changed the subject. Then she suggested, in the spring of that second year, that I might want to give Owen power of attorney. She framed it as a practical matter. Just so Owen can help you manage things if something ever happened. It's what a lot of people do at your stage. I was 62. I was in good health. I had managed my own finances for over 3 decades without incident. I told her I already had a lawyer and that my affairs were in order. She smiled and said, "Of course," and moved on. I called my lawyer the following Monday morning. Not because I was panicked, because I was paying attention. My lawyer. I worked with the same firm in Oakville for 18 years, listened to what I described and asked me some careful questions. We updated my documents, clarified the terms of my living will, and she made a note of our conversation. "Just in case," she said. I agreed. Just in case. What I didn't know yet was how much there was to find. It started with a phone call from my son's colleague, a man named Peter, who had worked with Owen for several years and who called me one afternoon in October because, he said, he didn't know who else to call. Owen hadn't been himself lately. He'd mentioned financial stress. He'd looked exhausted for weeks. Peter thought I should know. I thanked him. I sat with it for a day. Then I drove to Hamilton unannounced on a Saturday morning, which I almost never do. Owen answered the door in yesterday's clothes. Diane was not home. Out, he said, vaguely. I made coffee. I sat across from my son at the kitchen table where I had noticed 2 years earlier that his name was the only one on the mortgage, and I asked him, quietly, how things were going. He held it together for about 4 minutes. Then he put his face in his hands. It came out in pieces, the way these things do. Diane had taken out a line of credit against the house. A HELOC, home equity line of credit, without telling him. He had only found out because a notice from the bank had come to the house addressed to both of them, which confused him since he hadn't signed anything. When he asked her about it, she told him it was for home improvements that she'd handled it, that he didn't need to worry. The amount was $74,000. There were no home improvements. He didn't know what the money had been used for. She managed all of their shared accounts. She had suggested this early in the marriage, said it would be more efficient, and Owen, who trusted her, had agreed. He had direct deposit going into a joint account. He had a credit card for daily expenses. He did not, it turned out, have a clear picture of where their money was going. I asked him if I could see the statements. He hesitated. Then he got up, went to the office at the back of the house, and came back with a folder of papers that looked like they'd been partially sorted and then abandoned. I spent 2 hours at that kitchen table. By the end of it, I had a reasonably clear picture. The HELOC funds had moved into an account Diane held separately. There were recurring transfers to that account from the joint account as well, described in the transaction notes as household and miss, and occasionally nothing at all. Diane's personal account, as far as Owen knew, had been opened before the marriage and remained in her name alone. He had never seen statements from it. I did not say everything I was thinking. I told Owen that I wanted to help, that we needed to be careful, and that before he confronted Diane again, he should speak to a lawyer. He pushed back on this. She would think he was overreacting. She would be hurt. She always had an explanation for everything. I had heard this before from people who were being financially controlled, and I recognized it. I told him I understood, and that I wasn't asking him to accuse anyone of anything. I was asking him to get information. He agreed reluctantly. I drove home to Oakville, and I started making calls. I want to be careful here about what I describe as investigation because I was not, at that point, doing anything covert. I was making inquiries. I contacted the Land Registry office in Hamilton and pulled the title history on the house. I spoke with a forensic accountant I had worked with during my years at CRA. I began keeping notes, dates, amounts, descriptions, in a way I hadn't done since I was working. What I found over the following 6 weeks was layered in a way that took time to understand fully. The HELOC was the most obvious piece. But there was also the matter of Diane's business. She had registered a numbered company in Ontario, a corporation technically, though its actual business activity was difficult to identify. This company had received payments from the property management firm where she worked, described in filings as consulting fees. The amounts were not trivial. The arrangement had certain characteristics that, from my years at CRA, I recognized as patterns sometimes associated with income splitting or unreported income. I was not making accusations, I was noticing patterns. There was also the matter of the previous marriage. I had respected Diane's privacy about this for 3 years, but when I pulled public court records, which are available to anyone, I found that her previous marriage had ended not in quiet mutual separation, but in a contested divorce in which her former husband had filed allegations of financial misconduct. The case had been settled, the terms were sealed, but the filing existed. And then there was the power of attorney suggestion, which I had not forgotten. I started wondering, not dramatically, just quietly, the way you test a hypothesis, whether Diane had known at some point what she was doing and had been planning further ahead than I had appreciated. In November, Owen finally spoke to a family law lawyer in Hamilton. He called me afterwards, shaken. The lawyer had confirmed that Diane's use of the HELOC without full disclosure could constitute financial abuse under the definition used by Ontario family law. She had also noted that the status of Diane's personal corporation might have implications for how assets were characterized in any separation proceeding. Owen said the word separation like it was something foreign in his mouth. I told him I loved him and that whatever he decided, I was there. It was 2 weeks after that call. 2 weeks, while Owen was trying to process everything, and Diane was, as far as either of us knew, unaware of what he'd discovered, that she made the comment at the dinner table. It was a Sunday in December. I had come down to Hamilton for what I thought would be a quiet afternoon, perhaps a chance for Owen and me to talk further. His brother-in-law was visiting from London, Ontario. Diane's younger brother, a man I'll call by his first initial only, R, who found Diane's cruelties funny. There were 4 of us at the table. Diane had made a point of asking, in front of everyone, how my little library job was going. I explained I'd stepped back due to my wrist. She tilted her head with that particular expression of hers, sympathy shaped like contempt, and said it. 63 years old and you can't even hold down a part-time position at the library. What does that feel like, honestly? Her brother laughed. Owen went very still. I set down my fork. I looked at her, and I smiled. Diane, I said, I spent 31 years investigating financial fraud for the federal government. I'd be happy to discuss what things feel like, but perhaps not at the dinner table. The room was quiet. She recovered quickly. She always did. And made some deflecting comment about how she was only joking, how I was so sensitive, how typical. Owen said her name, once, sharply, and she stopped. The dinner continued, but something had changed in the room, and everyone at the table felt it. Owen called me that evening after I'd driven home. He said he'd made a decision. He had spoken to his lawyer again, and he was proceeding. What followed was not simple or quick, and I want to be honest about that, because these situations never are. Owen moved out of the Hamilton house in January and stayed with a colleague while the legal process began. Diane was initially dismissive. She told Owen's lawyer that his mother had poisoned him against her, and that she intended to fight everything. She retained a lawyer in Mississauga. But the documentation was significant. The forensic accountant had produced a detailed analysis of the HELOC funds and the transfers to Diane's personal account. The records from Diane's numbered company raised sufficient questions that CRA's General Inquiry Line, when I provided them anonymously with the company registration number and a summary of the patterns I'd observed, confirmed that the matter had been referred to a review. I did not manufacture evidence. I compiled what existed and put it in front of people whose job it was to examine it. The property was the central issue. The house had appreciated somewhat since they bought it. Hamilton prices had been volatile, but the property was worth approximately $740,000 at the time of separation. The HELOC of $74,000 was outstanding. Owen's lawyer argued successfully that Diane's unilateral drawing of the HELOC without informed consent constituted dissipation of family property. This affected the equalization calculations substantially. Owen received a settlement that, while not everything, was fair, and critically, it included the return of a significant portion of what had been moved through Diane's personal account. The CRA review of Diane's corporation was, as of the time Owen's divorce was finalized, still ongoing. I don't know where it stands now. That is not my business to follow. Owen is back in Burlington now. He bought a smaller place, a condo on Brant Street, nothing fancy, but his. He rebuilt his RRSP contribution room with the settlement funds and has started, quietly and without fanfare, to piece things back together. He calls me on Sundays again. Diane's lawyer sent my son's lawyer a letter at one point accusing me of harassment and interference. It was reviewed and set aside. There is no legal definition of harassment that encompasses a retired CRA auditor reading publicly available documents and answering questions from her own son. I think about that dinner sometimes, about how she said it with such ease, such confidence that I would absorb it and say nothing. I think about how she had read me as someone who could be managed, who would smile politely and look away and cause no trouble. She wasn't entirely wrong about the smile. She was wrong about what it meant. I smiled because by December I had 6 weeks of documented evidence, a forensic accountant's preliminary report, a consultation with a family law lawyer, and an anonymous referral already submitted to CRA. I smiled because I had done this kind of work for 3 decades, and I knew exactly what I was looking at. I smiled because there was nothing left to be angry about. The work was done. The rest was just process. Owen told me once, during those hard months, that he was sorry for not seeing it sooner. I told him what I believed then, and believe now. These situations are designed not to be seen. The person doing the harm understands, usually intuitively, how to keep the confusion close to the surface. Enough friction, enough affection, enough small explanations that almost make sense. The goal is to make you feel like the problem is your perception, not their actions. Owen is not a foolish man. He was a trusting one. There is a difference. I drove down to Burlington last spring to help him hang a few pictures and put up some shelves. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor of his new living room because the couch hadn't been delivered yet. He looked tired, still, but lighter, like someone who had put down something heavy. He thanked me, at one point, for making the calls and keeping the records and knowing what to do. I told him anyone would have done the same. He said quietly that he didn't think that was true. Maybe it isn't, but it's what mothers are for, not just the Sundays and the dinners and the ordinary presence of a person who loves you. Sometimes it's knowing, when the moment comes, that the right response to cruelty is not rage and not tears. Sometimes it's just a smile, and the 31 years of work behind it that the other person knows nothing about. I keep coming back to that dinner table, the way Diane said it, not in a whisper, not in a moment of anger she might later regret, but clearly, almost cheerfully, with her brother sitting right there. She wanted an audience. She wanted me to feel small in front of people, to absorb it quietly and look away. That tells you something about a person. Not just their cruelty, but their confidence in it. She had done it before. She expected it to work again. What she didn't understand, what I think people like her rarely understand, is that there is a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice at the table or make a scene in the kitchen. It shows up on a Monday morning when you make a phone call to a forensic accountant you worked with 20 years ago. It shows up in a folder of bank statements spread across a kitchen table on a quiet Saturday. It looks from the outside like patience. From the inside, it feels like clarity. I think about Owen a lot when I reflect on all of this. He isn't a naive person. He's a careful, intelligent man who trusted someone who had studied him, studied what he needed, what he feared, what he would accept. That's not weakness. That's the result of someone working very hard to be trusted and then using that trust as a tool. The harm in those situations isn't a single explosion. It accumulates in small concessions, small confusions, small moments where you tell yourself you're probably overreacting. By the time it's visible, it's been going on for years. What I've learned, not from this situation alone, but from 3 decades of work that prepared me for it without my knowing, is that integrity isn't only about what you do when people are watching. It's about the decisions you make when no one would ever know the difference. I could have said nothing after Peter called me. I could have told myself it wasn't my place. Owen was an adult. It was his life. And maybe the easiest thing, the thing that would have caused me the least disruption, would have been to stay at a comfortable distance and hope it resolved itself. But that's not what honest people do. Honest people look at what's in front of them and they name it. Carefully, with evidence, without drama, and then they do the work. The quiet, unglamorous, time-consuming work of getting it right. I'm proud of Owen for the courage it took to walk away. Leaving something that has become familiar, even when it's harming you, takes more out of a person than most people realize. He had to grieve something alongside everything else. He did it anyway. And I think about that smile. People who saw this story asked me what I meant by it, what I was thinking in that moment. The honest answer is, I wasn't thinking anything dramatic. I was thinking that the work was already done, that everything that needed to be in place was in place, that there was nothing left to be afraid of. That's what 31 years of doing the right thing, consistently, without applause, actually builds in a person. Not invincibility. Not revenge. Just a kind of steadiness that cruelty can't reach. Diane counted on me being diminished. She had been watching me for 3 years and decided I was someone who could be managed. She wasn't entirely wrong about the smile. She was wrong about everything it meant.